Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first split session at AusCERT 2017. Just before we get started, just a reminder to everybody, the usual sort of things: put your mobile phone on silent, and you can ask questions via the mobile app, which hopefully we'll be able to get access to those questions. Otherwise, Frank will be taking questions during his presentation, as well as there should be time at the end. For this first session, we've got Frank Walsh from Malwarebytes, who will be happy to introduce himself. So please give Frank a round of applause and a warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So my name is Frank Walsh. I'm the Vice President of Solution Architecture at Malwarebytes. I am responsible for our global sales engineering team, as well as our integration efforts with other security practitioners and solutions in the market space. How many of you are familiar with Malwarebytes, the brand? Great. That's what I usually expect to see. So I started my career about 15 years ago and put myself through college disinfecting malware at a local computer store. And I recall that one of the first tools that I had access to for malware disinfection was Malwarebytes. And so our brand has been synonymous for a long period of time with the idea of remediation. We're an alternative to wiping and reloading in every case that a malware infection occurs. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. Our agenda is going to be the focus initially on the continued growth of malware that we're seeing in the marketplace. And then subsequently, we'll talk a little bit about how quickly malware is being distributed and the techniques in which it's being distributed, and also a little bit about methods used by malware authors to evade detection. So what we're seeing in the marketplace today is that malware continues to grow and morph. Basically, we're seeing that on a weekly basis, 2,100 different families and variants are being added to our intelligence that's sweeping the entire world. We're recognizing that malware samples are being authored no longer by hacktivists. They are being authored by malicious attackers with specific goals in mind. How many of you have experienced a malware infection in the last 12 months of any type? Wow, I think that probably a little more honesty here. I think every one of us has in some way experienced a malware attack, and if we aren't aware that we've experienced one, we may have experienced one without knowing. Last week we had the Eternal Blue attack that was leveraged in order to deploy WannaCry. We are now seeing a variant of ransomware I'll talk about a little that's actually using a fileless approach and Eternal Blue for delivery. Specific intent. Right now we're seeing that malicious attackers have specific intent in both targeting consumers and businesses, and malware is multi-purpose, right? So in addition to having a single goal in mind, almost every malware sample that we're seeing out there has a number of purposes in mind. Some of those purposes include ransomware, ad fraud, Android delivery. We're seeing an advent of malware samples that are targeting Android devices. Botnets, we're seeing banking Trojans, and I'll talk a little more in just a moment about how we're seeing the prevalence of banking Trojans specifically in Australia. Adware, and finally, we're seeing some activity in the cryptocurrency miners area, which is leading to degraded system performance and allowing malicious attackers to leverage enterprise and consumer resources to actually mine cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. And finally, this advent of additional attacks and attack surface and variants and families of malware is basically being fueled in many ways by modifications to malware techniques for deployment and also techniques to avoid detection and finally to add and remove functionality on demand, right? So if we take that number that I initially said, 2,100 infections occurring on a weekly basis that we're seeing in our threat intelligence, and we take it out to a 3-month period, that equates to 26,000 newly modified samples and malware family and variants that we're recording on a 3-month basis. And finally, on a yearly basis, this equates to approximately 104,000 newly modified malware families and variants in the marketplace. And so when we think about that and we think specifically about Australia, Malwarebytes this past year, every year we run what we call the State of Malware Report, which consists of the information we gather from the 100 million Windows and Android devices in the consumer space running our free version of Malwarebytes. And this is basically anytime an individual visits our site and downloads Malwarebytes with the end goal of removing an infection that was not prevented by their traditional on-host defenses, right, like AV or any other next-gen provider, we find out what solutions failed that we're cleaning up after. This sampling that we did occurred over approximately 200 countries, and what we found were approximately 1 billion detected malware samples, measuring the impacts of the 6 categories that you're seeing on the right. Here's what we found out about malware in Australia. So specifically, malware, the category of banking Trojans was notable in Australia. Australia was ranked 7th in global detections in banking Trojans. That's 10 times the global average. We also found that Australia ranked 8th in ad fraud, 18th in Android malware, and another area of notable malware infection in Australia was ransomware. Australia ranked 6th in global detection of ransomware, and in our survey period of the month of October last year, we saw that 31.4% of all the server ransomware detections occurred in Australia. So we all know very well about the attack that occurred last week with WannaCry. We would not probably consider that the most effective deployment of ransomware, although it generated a tremendous amount of attention in the news. When you look at the effectiveness to extract revenue, the Bitcoin wallet last I checked had around $90,000 in it. When you think about it, a targeted attack that's more specifically targeting a specific business can likely achieve that type of return without the type of media attention or national focus by both intelligence agencies and security providers. So when we think about this and we think about looking at how malware has developed over the last decade, we've seen a continued trend, right? Moving from, in 2008, approximately 20 million cases of malware and instances of malware that we found, straight all the way through to, in 2017, figures which represent that will exceed what we've seen in 2014, 15, and 16. So the question is how? We know why. We know that hackers are no longer just hacktivists, right? They've determined a way by which they can create profit out of the installation of malware on endpoints. But how? How are malicious attackers able to accomplish these types of attacks with this level of efficiency, right? And the real answer is that the barrier to becoming a malicious attacker has significantly dropped, right? And I'll describe a couple different ways by which that barrier to entry has dropped, both in delivery and detection evasion. First, I want to talk a little bit about different categories of malware techniques by which malware avoids detection. The first I would call polymorphic malware, and really these are techniques by which malicious attackers adjust the appearance of malware to avoid detection, right? So pre-execution detection before something runs. The second category I would refer to as metamorphic malware. These are changes in behavior, and there are techniques which I would consider simple in modifying the internal logic of malware or adding junk logic around the malicious code in malware to basically avoid behavioral detection techniques. But there are also some advanced techniques that are employed by sophisticated attacks, APT-style attacks, and targeted threat actors in the space. And then finally, we're seeing the advent of what I would refer to as genetic malware. And these are malware samples that are delivered in many cases in 2 parts. They use a unique fingerprint of the machine that they're attempting to target to basically encrypt the delivered payload. And if that malware is attempted to be detonated on another machine, it won't detonate because the fingerprint is necessary to decrypt the malware. The value that this presents to a malicious attacker is that it makes it very, very difficult to reverse engineer a piece of malware that's genetic in the way it's protected. The idea is that in protecting malware using a genetic protection, malicious attacker can basically target a specific host, avoid detection on that host, and avoid any sort of behavioral analysis that might come through the process of reverse engineering or intelligence-based defense layer that is updated using the research performed by a malware research team at any organization or security provider. So when we think about these pre- and post-execution techniques to avoiding detection, really, and then we think about how the barrier to entry has changed. There's a number of specific tools which are available now to cyber criminals or wannabe cyber criminals, anyone who has an interest in delivering and creating malware. We refer to them as builders, right? And so in many cases, these simply started out as GUIs sold with malware on the darknet, which provided a malicious attacker or wannabe malicious attacker the ability to basically adjust things like the communication point by which the malware communicated back with, the messaging in a ransomware attack, the Bitcoin delivery wallet, which the ransom can be delivered to. But really, it's grown quite a bit. There's now builders out there that support modularized techniques by which malware can be customized to avoid protection from different things like sandboxing, add flexible functionality to malware, right, focused on the categories I described before: ransomware, ad fraud, botnets, banking trojans, adware, and currency miners. And then finally, even delay execution, right, to avoid behavioral detection layers. So there are a couple of great examples of this. We have ransomware as a service. How many of you are familiar with what ransomware as a service is? So a couple of you, yeah. So on the darknet now, you can actually just simply purchase access to ransomware and direct it to any cyber currency wallet that you have on the web. So the barrier of entry is simply finding a location where you can actually purchase this ransomware service. You don't need any infrastructure. You simply need to be able to pay the malware author. We've also recognized that malware authors have actually developed almost like a channel partner network inside the darknet, which allows them to have a layer of obscurity or between them and the purchaser of malware. This actually allows a malicious attacker to, a malware author to actually terminate access on demand if they, question the actual person purchasing it, or if they decide that they're actually done with their, if they've made enough, which we've seen in some cases where malware authors or ransomware authors have actually disabled and just offered up the public key at the conclusion of their enterprise. So a couple different families that we are known to use this type of technique. Obviously Zeus we saw, which was, everybody knows, Spy Eye, Citadel, Black Energy Bot. We've seen a number of emerging malware families and malware authors and crime syndicates that are designing their malware in such a way. We've actually also seen revenue sharing with malware authors. We've not only seen malware authors who are, for example, selling access to their malware families as a single price, but they're also saying, I'll sell it to you at a reduced price, and at that reduced price, I'll provide you 70-30 revenue share and any revenue that's generated. So the important point to make here is, beyond this builder tool being a way that malicious attackers or would-be malicious attackers have an approach by which they can perform criminal activity, is that the malicious attack that we're dealing now with criminal enterprises, right? We're no longer dealing with hacktivists. We're dealing with folks who not only are capable to build sophisticated tools to breach the enterprise, exfiltrate information, move laterally, perform privilege escalation. We're dealing with folks who actually have developed business models and staffs around the deployment and distribution of these tools. So Builders is the first tool that I think is relevant to how the barrier to entry has lowered. Another really powerful tool, which we're seeing, is cryptors, right? And cryptors have a few different goals. The first is to obfuscate compiled binaries with custom algorithms. We also see the addition of what I would consider junk code, right? These are techniques by which a malicious attacker attempts to avoid post-execution behavioral analysis, right? Or techniques by which sandboxing might identify a specific sequence of code. There are a number of techniques that are both simple and, as I shared on the past slide, a number of advanced techniques that are used to obfuscate. But what we've seen is that malicious attackers who have the ability to design an approach by which they will extract revenue from a target are now leveraging a separate group of malicious actors who are actually designing ways by which they can manipulate the internal logic and delivery of malware to protect it from detection both pre and post execution. So a couple other things about cryptors. Cryptors have the ability to hide malware from both antivirus and anti-malware engines, right? These are sophisticated techniques that employ abilities that cover both AV and next-gen solutions. They are able to quickly modify the same versions of malware numerous times, and it's not just an application which a would-be malicious attacker uses to modify it on demand. There are actually techniques by which malware itself can actually mutate and modify itself at each execution, and then use tools like Eternal Blue to actually deliver a completely mutated version of the malware to another host. And then finally, I mentioned the use of junk code and random input to obfuscate the actual behavioral activities being performed. So when we think of all this, we relate this to an underground marketplace for builders, cryptors, and malware. We've seen that there are a number of cryptors that are available that are less effective, they're cheap, and sometimes even free. The best cryptors are very expensive and are sold as a service rather than an individual product, and cyber criminals spend more money hiding their malware from detection than they do even trying to distribute it to their victims, or in many cases even author it, right? So we also see in the delivery a number of techniques that are being employed by malicious attackers to support communication between a remote host and a control server. One such technique that's been around for quite a while would be domain generation algorithms, right? And these are now being used in combination with the advent of cloud providers like AWS that allow you to change IP and move around the web using public service providers very, very quickly, right? So the idea behind a domain generation algorithm is that any technology that you're employing at the perimeter or inside at the network level or on the host monitoring communication that's occurring with remote hosts either by FQDN or IP is now variable, right? So it becomes even more difficult for us to monitor based on blacklists, or threat intelligence which is gathered. These, as I mentioned, can evade blacklists and of known malicious URLs, URIs, and IPs. And the end goal here is that they allow for longer communication with command and control servers, right? In combination with delayed activation or techniques by which a malicious attacker can on demand reactivate a piece of malware. We've even seen instances where malware is leveraging services like Google Drive, right, or Google Docs to perform communication for reactivation, right? And in combination with techniques like domain generation algorithms, we're able to see where malicious attackers are able to remain persistent in the environment and keep the ability to communicate with infected hosts. Really, this is one of the major changes that's occurred over the last few years, and we've seen all different types of fileless malware attacks through exploitation of both the operating system. We saw last week the Eternal Blue. The shadow brokers have said they're going to be releasing a new exploit on a monthly basis. But in addition to exploiting operating system capabilities, there's also the ability to exploit almost each and every standard application on a desktop. Office products, Acrobat, different media browsers, media players. These are techniques by which a malicious attacker, through loading a specific piece of content or executing, for example, a piece of JavaScript embedded into a delivered HTML web page, can cause an application, a completely valid application installed with privileged access to machine resources to perform some unintended function, right? And so in many cases, we've seen that not only are these tools being used to actually perform malicious behavior, but they're also being used as delivery mechanisms for malicious payloads, right? So in combination with the tools that I mentioned before, cryptors, packers, and builders, this provides a way by which malicious attackers can deliver malicious payloads, or they can simply embed hide content in the registry, which allows and persists malware on the endpoint, or even causes a process that's expected to perform a specific function to do something malicious. And in many cases, this is a big gap for most AV solutions, and in some cases, I think even a real gap for next-gen solutions. We see Microsoft having recently depreciated Emmet. Exploit prevention is a field where we find that a number of security vendors haven't had the focus that's necessary to protect their customers. So another technique, or a family that we've seen that's employing this fileless malware approach would be Copter. And last year we saw 500,000 infections of Copter. The initial purpose of Copter really has been to perform ad fraud operations, but it's important to note that, first of all, anything that's performing ad fraud operations has the ability to click something that might be embedded into a web page. And if a malicious attacker has the ability to control your web browser, they'd also have the ability to deliver additional malware. So in the past 12 months, we've actually seen instances where Copter was being utilized to disable security software, and also more specifically to deliver ransomware. So we've also seen that malicious attackers are being more intelligent about how they're targeting hosts, right? So one early stage, if we look at Lockheed Martin's kill chain, is the ability to identify vulnerable hosts, right? And so there are a number of techniques in most web browsers by which a piece of JavaScript content embedded into a page, or even embedded into the header of a GIF, can be used by a malicious attacker to identify vulnerable applications or in-place security defense solutions on an endpoint. This allows a malicious attacker to avoid creating enough noise to alert your security team to a potential event in progress. And it also allows them to avoid detection by ad network providers, or even malware research teams like Malwarebytes. So this is a technique that we have a unique defense layer at Malwarebytes to support. I could talk a little bit about that in just a minute, but really the fingerprint techniques approach to what it's trying to do is malware and exploit code checks the conditions on a specific victim machine. If conditions are met, an attack performs. If not, the malware will just simply wait for a target host that is susceptible. So really what we're seeing is a war of attrition here with malware authors and with malicious crime syndicates. Malicious crime syndicates malware attackers are looking for the lowest hanging fruit, really. They're attempting to identify, in many cases, instances where environments are unpatched, right? I think last week we saw a real evidence as to how common having unpatched environments is. So security hygiene is a big role, plays a big role in defending your enterprise, but it's never going to be perfect, right? The whole definition of zero-day exploit is that it's something we didn't know about. And so you should expect that we'll have continued zero-day exploits, as well as what I'd like to refer to as living off the land attack approaches. Yesterday on our blog, we talked about an approach by which SCF files can be used to actually deliver user account and NTLM v2 hash. How many are familiar with what an SCF file is? Anyone? I wasn't either. So it's actually a file that, if in a folder on a Windows host, will cause some action to be taken when the folder is opened. We've actually also found a way by which in Google Chrome, an SCF file can be delivered to the endpoint's downloads folder without any interaction by the end user, simply by visiting a page that generates the SCF file. The SCF file then contains information referencing an icon. That icon can be referenced via an SMB path. So you can actually reference a remote IP using both a icon file that doesn't actually exist, and in the request over SMB, the credentials that are for the logged in user account will actually be transmitted. So we're seeing a number of techniques that are being employed, not just for the delivery of malware using exploitation, but actually using even intended functions of applications that are on a machine. And the operating system function. So things that fingerprinting attacks check for, specific operating systems, browsers that are in use, not just the major browser vendor, but also specific versions and subversions. URL referrers, this is how they in many cases detect if someone is coming from a legitimate source or is a malware researcher or some sort of technique by which an advertising network is polling their network or their ad network to search for malicious attackers. And then finally, for security software, right? Avoiding security software allows them to use the same techniques repeatedly over longer periods of time and also avoid detection in the space at the target. And then finally, they're also embedding techniques utilizing techniques to defeat auto-analysis, right? So we've seen in our State of Malware report, we pointed out that as hard as it is to believe, mouse spamming is actually still the #1 source of malware infection that we're seeing in the enterprise. So it's been around a long time, but actually turned that into a business. So a malware author who has purchased a tool, maybe a builder or ransomware as a service or malware as a service, can actually create a relationship with a botnet or a mouse spam provider that is actually going to deliver the content to a large body of endpoints or users in hope of having them open one of these attachments. So we've seen that actually a number of techniques are being used. The first being password protection, another being actually embedding malicious code inside Word documents, inside PowerPoint documents, using Visual Basic Script and OLE objects. This is another significant gap we're seeing in a number of security providers in the space. We're seeing that the actual behavior of running applications, their analysis of Visual Basic Script or OLE objects, or activities, for example, being performed by Adobe Acrobat are not being considered as a malicious activity or not be considered with the stringency that we think is necessary. And then finally, I mentioned a little earlier, genetic malware. Really, I think this is where we're headed in a lot of cases. We're headed to a place where malicious attackers specifically target and encrypt based on characteristics of the host they're looking to attack. And this will significantly raise the bar for malware researchers, as well as any technology which, like sandboxing, which attempts to take a malware sample and analyze its activities. Because if activated on a host other than the target host, it's an inert object. It's just not going to run. It's not going to do anything. And then, so really, to review, malware is constantly changing multiple times a day. As I mentioned, we're seeing about 1 million infections last year that we cleaned up from providers across the world. We're also seeing that effective detection is difficult to achieve given these new techniques. In many cases, any piece of security software that is available to you is also available to malicious attackers. You should assume that any malicious attacker targeting your enterprise or opportunistically trying to breach your enterprise has considered that you have perimeter defenses in place, like a firewall, like sandboxing technologies, like IDS, IPS solutions on the enterprise, that you have an AV solution, that you have a next-gen solution, that you're patching to a reasonable degree. So they're considering these things and testing their solutions against different techniques that are being used to prevent attacks both pre and post-execution. And finally, more malware leads to more problems, right? We're seeing all different types of unique ways by which malicious attackers are taking malware and changing it to accomplish different goals. The most recent, I think, would be the cryptocurrency mining, right? Using system resources almost the way 10 years ago SETI did in the study of extraterrestrial life. So, and then finally, proactive protection is key, right? I think that I'll share a little detail about what Malwarebytes believes about proactive protection and the implementation and employment of these different techniques. But basically, protection is a balance, both at the network level and at the host level, and also is a balance of both protection technologies and hygiene, improving hygiene and remaining focused on true real-time visibility and action taking when it comes to getting a host up to date as far as patching. And lastly, we employ here at Malwarebytes an approach by which we attempt to stop the delivery truck as well as the package. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So today's endpoint protections, typically we see utilization of what I would call traditional anti-malware. You could call it antivirus. Viruses are almost a thing of the past. Viruses, when I think of viruses, I think of something before malicious attackers really could monetize their malicious intent. Now really that they can. Traditional AV solutions are also what we call traditional anti-malware solutions. And then we see that next-gen providers are offering this additional layer of pre-execution prevention. And in many cases, we see providers offering maybe 1 or 2 defense layers in the approach of protecting from the execution of malware. And then finally, this is where Malwarebytes comes in, right? So we have been known in the space for cleaning up when these solutions fail. Here's how Malwarebytes thinks about endpoint protection, and here's how we encourage you to think about endpoint protection. So if we think about prevention techniques, pre-execution prevention techniques, and we put them into 2 categories. The first being intelligence-based, and the second being really behavioral-based, right? We believe that, when we look at traditional AV solutions, typically they were intelligence-based, right? They're signature-based, or they employed some limited approach to inspecting the payload pre-execution. We've now seen the advent of anomaly detection capabilities, some of which are behavioral based, others which are using pattern recognition or pattern matching, which we would refer to as machine learning as a defense layer. Where Malwarebytes kind of changes this, and what we do that I think is unique in the space is a number of different pre-execution layers are added, as well as a post-execution behavioral monitoring. So we do believe that there's still value to be had in intelligence-based defense layers. We think that they do provide some limited value, but especially when used in conjunction in a depth and defense strategy. So the first layer we employ is a layer we refer to as web protection. This is a curated list of threat intelligence URIs and IPs we know to be serving bad content. We're curating this on a 0-hour basis from approximately 100 million endpoints connected to our consumer product, using our consumer product. Underneath that, we have an application hardening layer. This is a technique by which we prevent vulnerable applications from being fingerprinted. I shared a little bit about how our malicious attackers are fingerprinting to identify vulnerable machines and specifically deliver exploit or samples that will take effect on a machine. Exploit mitigation, we have both an operating system and third-party application technique by which we hook and monitor the activities being performed by any application or the operating system, looking for typical activities indicative of malicious attack. We have a application behavior defense layer. This is where we monitor the ability to utilize things like OLE objects or visual basic scripts embedded in Word documents for things that should never be done. For example, a PDF document reaching out to a remote host and grabbing content from and trying to launch a process. Beneath that, we do have a machine learning defense layer. We think machine learning is a great component of a solid defense strategy, but we do not think it's a single defense layer that you should employ universally. We think it's one of many different strategies. And then finally, we have our intelligence and analysis layer, our heuristic defense layer, supported by the threat telemetry we update on a 0-hour basis. Those are all pre-execution. Post-execution, we have a behavioral monitoring layer, and the goal here is to monitor the actual activities being performed by anything that executes on the host, looking for those indicative of attack. For example, in the case of ransomware, things like the disabling of VSS, the deletion of restore points, enumeration of files, the encryption of files very, very quickly. And when used in combination, these pre-execution and post-execution defense layers provide a solid approach to defending from attack. You will still have instances where malware, for example, with a detonation timer, which it doesn't become active until a certain point, may infect a machine, but that's where I think Malwarebytes also stands alone in our remediation function, our ability to remove malware from a machine once it's actually penetrated the enterprise. So that's the way Malwarebytes thinks about malware protection and remediation. I'm going to take any questions you guys may have. We're going to just a couple minutes here. Any questions about the techniques that I described, or the approach to prevention that I'm showing here? Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just a question on what's your position on AI in the malware space?
Yeah. So I think when I was talking about anomaly detection, that's what I'm referring to. When we think about AI or machine learning, we're thinking about predictive analytics, pattern recognition, or pattern matching, techniques by which we take large samples of data and derive inferences on pieces of malware that we may never have seen. We believe it's a one solid defense strategy when used in combination with a number of other techniques. We think right now the idea that AI is a solitary layer of defense is short-sighted, quite honestly. We think it's a good part of a solid strategy, but at this point we still believe there's significant value derived from human analysis and also behavioral analysis guided by human inspection of malware. As long as the logical adjustments that a machine learning layer is making to the way it prevents or detects malware on a machine is driven by programmatic logic, which is reasonably static, there's the opportunity for a malicious attacker to look for ways to exploit that and be guaranteed some window of time in which that exploitation of a vulnerability or weakness in that strategy will work. When used in combination with other behavioral defense layers and also human guided intelligence, it does provide some significant value. But it's important to realize that we've gone through a number of phases over the past 20 years of AI winters, and we don't expect right now AI. We don't believe AI is at a point where it's a replacement for all of these other defense layers used in depth. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, great.
Can you talk more about the delivery methods?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a number of different delivery methods being employed. For example, mouse spam. I mean, we have drive-by downloads is another technique is exploit kits. I didn't get all that much into exploit kits, but exploit kits are also available right now for purchase on the darknet. These are folks who spend their time looking for ways to and looking to discover techniques by which applications and operating systems can be exploited. I mentioned the folks at Shadow Brokers intend to release a new exploit on a monthly basis, so we should expect that Eternal Blue isn't the end, right? We have seen instances where malware is specifically being used as a backdoor. We, for example, see how Eternal Blue has been used in combination with Double Pulsar to actually provide a backdoor for delivery of other malware samples. I mentioned the utilization of, if we go back here, let me show you, of COVTR and how COVTR is being used as a delivery mechanism, right? So there's a number of different vertices. If I was to go through them off the top of my head, we have drive-by download, phishing, social engineering, We have packaged with pups and pums. Malwarebytes also believes that pups and pums create additional opportunity. Malvertising, application exploit. We've actually seen, for example, the SCF approach that I just mentioned is a way by which a malicious attacker can live off the land using just embedded features of the operating system. So we're seeing a number of different techniques in place. I think we also have recognized that the tried and trusted and actually older techniques like mouse spam are still the most prevalent. If we look at what just happened with Eternal Blue, as I shared earlier, I would not consider that the most effective ransomware attack, given its prevalence and given, I mean, even the embedded backdoor, the attention it drew led to the discovery and, you know, and activation of that kill switch in just a matter of a day, right? If they had been a little more discriminatory in how the worm moved, they may have been able to accomplish far more damage, right? So I think we're going to see more worms. I think that this was the tip of the iceberg. I think it's going to reignite interest in worms. I think we're going to see more sophisticated worms over the next 24 months. I think we'll see people who are creating worms that don't just spread indefinitely without some type of control. And I'd expect to see fewer, if any, kill switches, like we saw in the WannaCry attack. So I think that we're seeing also another emerging space that we talk about in our state of malware part would be IoT devices, right? So these are devices that are, everything's an IoT device. Your car could be in some ways considered an IoT device. Your television, your refrigerator. I was just looking at a refrigerator with a computer built into it. So the interesting thing here is that these are not solutions that are easy to back up or easy to monitor the behavior of, right? And these are also hiding places for malicious attackers, right? They may compromise the enterprise using a Windows host, but then move and hide on an IoT device. So, yeah.
How effective do you believe the sandboxing technologies as a layer of defense is? It's kind of easy to get around it with fingerprinting and delay detonation and those sort of things.
Yeah, so we see value in sandboxing. I mean, Malwarebytes, for example, last year acquired a sandboxing technology. We think there's value in automated behavioral analysis that can support improvements in both the behavioral prevention and the intelligence defense layers. You know, we also see value in it to the end user, right, or to a business. You know, what I'm describing here are primarily host-based defense techniques and solutions. There's still a lot of value in having a strong perimeter and having a strong set of tools for analysis of anomalous activity, having a tool set to support proactive patching and to adjust your system configurations in real time. So I think there's value in it. Certainly, we're actually even looking at ways that it could play a role in host-based defense solutions in the future. Yeah.
Well, on behalf of AusCERT, I'd like to thank Frank for his interesting presentation on the current state of malware.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Yeah, lovely little hardwood cutting board.
Yeah,
and you should be able to get it in the plane.
All right, great.
That was quite interesting. I actually had a question, but since there were so many, I was just curious as to